All righty, folks. The elephant in the room, or at least he's soon to be in the room, is inflation. Is inflation sticky? Will CPI surprise and go up in the middle of May? Or is it like Kathy Wood and Jeremy Grantham and other folks going to fall off a cliff and soon we have deflation going on? To have this conversation, we're going to talk with the one and only Anna Kelly. How you doing, Anna?
I'm good. Always good to be here with you.
Yeah, so let's talk about inflation. It's currently, at least I think CPI last time was 6%, I believe. PCE was like 4.7. There's all these inflation things. The Fed's target is obviously 2%. No matter which statistic you look at, we are not near that. What do you think? Do you think inflation rolls over this year quickly? Do you think it's sticky at, call it 4%? Where does Anna play out in all this?
Sure. So one of the things that I've learned over time is depending on who you listen to, they might have very, very different outlooks. Like you mentioned, Kathy Woods and Jeremy Grantham, and I do listen to, what they have to say as well. But what you tend to find is you either have microeconomists or you have macroeconomists. And so you have economists that are looking at like a very short-term window, let's say 6 to 12 months, maybe out to 18 months. They're kind of these microeconomists. Then you look at macroeconomists that are looking like at the long-term trends and where things are going. And depending on whether you're listening to, economists just looking at the short term versus the long term, you're going to have a very different opinion on where inflation is going. And I'll say this, one thing, the more I learn, the more humble I become that I have a lot more left to learn and that
Me
there's
too.
still things that are new that we've never experienced before that I don't know the answer to, but I'm learning and looking at history to say, based on history, based on the way that the Fed reacts and governments react and the global community reacts, central banking coordination, et cetera, what is the most likely outcome, right? So with that said, I think that when you look at the micro, the short term, I think that inflation is starting to come down. We see very clear indications of that in terms of when you look at core inflation, you're looking at goods, you're looking at food, you're looking at energy, and then you're looking at services inflation. And what we've seen is, at least for now, energy inflation is kind of coming down. Food and the cost of goods are coming down. So inflation's kind of coming down in those areas, but services inflation is still high. Wage inflation, which mostly trickles into services, is still high. And therefore, and that piece I think is sticky. It's what the Fed is targeting, that wage inflation and trying to get unemployment up and people to stop spending as much and then wages come down. I think they're going to have a harder time actually getting that to come down unless we go into a deep recession. So Kathy's looking at more of these short-term things and going, right now, we're heading toward a lot of things going down. And you and I talked about, I think on episode 1 today, really looking at all the different components of the healthy economy. So the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at 10 key indicators to say, where are we in the cycle? And 8 of the 10 are in recessionary, deflationary territory. They're clearly on the downswing, but wages and employment are still high. And so that's why we're not technically in a recession, despite the fact that we have a lot of deflationary forces kind of pulling things in that way at the same time that we have this elevated inflation, with wages and employment. So temporarily in the short term, I think that as we head into a recession, as we have more layoffs, as unemployment goes up, we see inflation in the short term really start to come down. But when you look at the long term and what's going to happen over the next several years, I think inflation is far stickier than what Kathy Woods, says. And I'm happy to elaborate on that, throughout this episode.
Yeah, I think there's again, as somebody who has the econ degree, has a an MBA and all this stuff. What I try to tell the novice is inflation really has three components, and I call it the easy, the hard, and the really really hard.
Yeah.
The easy stuff are stuff you get from Amazon, right? They show up in boxes. I call that
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
That inflation is already rolled over. And I think that's where
Yes.
Kathy Wood's focus is. And it's gone from 9.1 at the peak of CPI to 6. Maybe there's a little bit left in goods inflation, but
Yeah.
that's about run its course. So that's the
Absolutely.
easy. The hard, and it's hard because it's it doesn't react to the timing that everybody wants, and that is housing costs, owner's equivalent rent, whatever you want to
Right.
call that inside CPI. This is where Jeremy Grantham's losing his mind, right? He's talking about, oh, it's 12 months and it's backward looking and it's all, I mean, what, Jeremy, where were you when it was underreporting, right? It's just, this is how the math works. And given the 12-month rolling forecast, it's kind of like a roller coaster, like a 12 car roller coaster. And we're might be getting really close to the peak. But that doesn't really come off until probably July at the earliest, but probably August. And then it will be 12 months of positive help, right? It'll bring inflation down. So I think by August, when housing rolls over, we could get to 4.5, 4.8, something like that. But then it's the really, really hard. And that is services, aka wages.
Right.
And that's, I mean, that could take another year, 18 months. People don't get it. This is not a moment in time thing, right? This is an economy
Right.
complex. We have the Hollywood writers go on strike. Why? Because they want more money. We have airline pilots threatening to go on strike. Why? Because they want more money. We have,
Right.
there was a rail strike threatened because they want more money. Folks, this is going to ripple through the economy for years. So I think getting inflation sub 4% is going to be a lot harder than people want.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And, we've talked about on this show, an average recession might last somewhere between, 8 and 18 months. It just depends on how bad it is, how deep it is, and how diffuse it is across the economy, right? So certain recessions only hit one sector like tech or manufacturing. A more diffuse recession is going to be really felt across the board in all industries. And so far, we've really only seen the major layoffs primarily in tech and in the banking system. We haven't started to see the trickle down of the pain and the layoffs into the rest of the economy really very much yet. And it usually lags. It takes some time. By the time a recession is declared and the Fed starts to pivot, it's generally still another, 12 to 18 months where you're still really struggling and trying to come through a recovery before you start back into that growth area. And so, wages are going to be sticky until you're later through, a recession than most. But in addition to that, just kind of talking about your categories versus my categories that are like very specific with the core. I think that what you have is when you look at wages specifically, it's really tied to demographics. How many people are working versus how many jobs are available. And what we've seen, and this is going to be more on the like Kathy Wood side for the short term, what we've seen is that we have one of the lowest labor force participation rates in history in the United States. And so we have more people that have chosen not to work, that maybe are in the age range that they could be working, but they're not for whatever reason. They're financially independent, they're on disability, they just don't think they need a job, they've got a spouse supporting them, whatever that may be. When you have fewer people having kids and replacing the people that are dying that were the workers of yesteryear, which we have a declining replacement population. So as the baby boomers are aging out, they're no longer working, they're no longer in that peak spending age. You have fewer people actually replacing them to start spending and working and to create prosperity and jobs. And so as you have fewer and fewer people, and as Americans, we get married later, we have fewer kids, it's more of a trend in that direction. What we've seen over time is that as the workforce starts to come down, what it does is it lowers GDP, but it also, because you just have less consumption, and GDP is coming down, they're trying to stimulate the economy with low interest rates. And so that starts to kind of bring interest rates down as your demographics comes down, except for in wages, because now all of a sudden fewer people are working for more jobs. They can demand higher wages. That demographic issue isn't going away. And the only real way to fix it is one of two things long term. You get people to start having more kids, right? China's done this. Okay, no more one child policy. Now we want to let you have two or more or whatever it is. Because when countries start to get below, I think it's like 2 point something kids per person, they start to struggle with wage inflation, and they start to struggle with all kinds of other issues, high cost of social benefits being borne by fewer taxpayers, et cetera. So what that does is it basically brings up wage inflation. The other thing, if you can't get people to create more kids, you have to allow immigration. You have to have a lot more people come into your country to take those jobs so that there's more people seeking fewer jobs, which brings down wage inflation. So unless and until the United States on both sides of, the aisle get together in Congress and open up the floodgates of immigration, which is really a polarizing issue, or you have a whole lot more babies, over the long term in the macro, we're just going to see wage inflation get worse and worse and higher. That increases inflation over time. So that makes me say inflation is sticky. It's going to be higher longer, especially in that wages and services area. Then you add to that, and I know we could break this into so many different topics, right? But you add to that, what's really happening post-COVID is we have this deglobalization. And for national security purposes, the United States on both sides is starting to say, wait a second, we need to reshore some things that we really need, like semiconductors, like chips, like energy. And we need to reshore components that we need for drugs and electronic vehicles. And so as you start to bring production back, there's a cost associated with that. And so the cost of everything you're making as you're trying to reshore things starts to go up. New jobs come up, but you start to see the costs of goods and services go up and wages go up, and potentially with all the ESG push, energy costs going up. If energy costs go up, what happens, Michael? It trickles down to food and services and goods. And so I think over the next 10 to 20 years or so, I think we see much higher inflation than the 2% we've seen in the past. And eventually, I think the governments are going to have to say, given the new era of everything, the new normal for inflation is 3 or 4, and then try to meet production to meet that. So that's just kind of my high level macro perspective. I think inflation is sticky, and it's not gone. It's not like the Fed wins and we're out of it. I think that we have much higher inflation over the long term than we did in the past.
Yeah, I think that last point about deglobalization is where I was going to go next, right? You add on top of that the demographics and the people wanting to work and all of that. And then you add on the fact that I do think deglobalization is real and will be a trend, not a blip. This services, aka wage inflation, years this is going to
Right.
be with us. It's structural. That's the different, I
Right.
think, this time is it's a structural change to our economy. Our
Right.
economy will look different 5 years from now than it does today because more stuff
And
will
then we
be.
have the same issue that Pal's worried about now. It's the wage price spiral. So if wages go up, people are making more money. There's new jobs that are available. It's going to cause housing, that middle section, that hard to go
Yep.
up too, because the
Yep.
cost of everything's going up. And then guess what the federal government does on the fiscal side is they start to raise taxes in order to pay for all the new stuff and the new infrastructure and deglobalization. And so you're going to have more people
Yep.
want to buy homes. You're going to have higher wages, and I think that the price of homes continues to go up over time, and that we continue the inflationary spiral,
Mhm.
however slow the Fed can do. And we really don't know because there's so many components. Like the Fed only has monetary policy. You also have to look at what is the federal government going to do with fiscal policy. Generally, they're going to have to spend a whole lot of money to reshore and rehome all of this stuff, which means they've got to find a way to pay for it. What are they going to do? They're going to inflate away the debt. They're going to cause inflation so that it's less expensive to pay for the debt that they're going to accumulate to pay for it all. And they're going to raise your taxes.
They're gonna raise your taxes. Absolutely. I don't know if you saw it, just close on this total right turn. California and New York in 2 years lost 90 billion in tax revenue from people moving
Wow.
out of state. 90 billion. That's a
Wow.
big number.
It's, it's a big number.
That's a big number. Well, Anna, do me a
It's
favor.
hard to do numbers when you're dealing with billions and
Yeah,
trillions and quadrillions now, right?
crazy stuff. Anyways, folks, Anna, where can people find you?
Great. You can find me here every week on social media, Anna Kelly, REI Mom, and on my website, reimom.com.
Thank you so much.